As a landscape photographer, image detail is very important, especially when producing large prints. So today I'm comparing the image quality between an APS-C camera and a full frame system to see what the real world difference actually is. So I'm here at this stunning castle destination today to see if I can capture a couple of images that we can print large. I think when an image is printed, it sets a level playing field for us to compare detail more closely. So stick around until the end, as there's lots to cover in today's video. So here we've got the Canon R5 and here we've got the Fuji X-H2. Obviously the Canon is the full frame model and the Fuji is the crop sensor version. Both professional cameras designed for professional photographers. And the lenses I'm going to be using today are also from the professional line. We've got the 24 to 70 f2.8 on the Canon, 16 to 55 f2.8 on the Fuji. And in the bag I've got the telephoto zoomed as well, the 70 to 200 and the 50 to 140. So I've got both cameras set up here on the tripods, exactly the same position, pointing at the castle. I've got my image stabilization turned off on both cameras as well. Shutter speed's quite high for this shot because it's very, very bright now, and I've chosen to shoot on the shady side of the castle and it's being backlit. So this is very, very challenging, a challenging situation for both cameras because we're shooting into the shadows. Yeah, so then I'm going to swing round and take a shot of the Millhouse with a telephoto lens because I'm really interested to see what the difference is in terms of a telephoto shot. Now there's good light on that subject, which is good. Now as you can tell, you might be able to hear a little bit of wind noise in the microphones. It's not particularly windy today, just a little bit of breeze, and because I'm using such a high shutter speed, that isn't really going to have any impact. Both of these cameras are locked down solidly on the tripod, so I don't think there's any issues there. So I'm going to move on now, see if I can get a shot of the Millhouse with a telephoto lens. So I've decided to shoot all of these scenes today at f8 because typically for a landscape photo that's kind of where I'm working in terms of depth of field, somewhere between f7.1 and f11, and generally speaking f8 is around the sweet spot of most lenses, so that's what we're going for here. And then we'll take these cameras, these images back to the computer, we'll take a look at them on Lightroom and then also do some prints and then blow some prints up and take a look at them side by side as well, because on paper that's when we really start to notice a difference. So that was a lot of fun down there this morning at a cracking location. I don't think conditions were particularly great for landscape photography, but that didn't really matter as I was really just interested in comparing the image quality between these two cameras, the X-H2 and the Canon R5. So here's all of the equipment lined up next to each other, and you can see the bodies are fairly similar in size. The lenses differ just slightly, but where the main difference is in terms of this setup is the cost. The Fuji setup's going to cost you £4,307, whereas the Canon setup is going to cost you a whopping £9,587. So you could buy two of these kits from Fuji and have £900 spare. So there's a significant difference. So just bear that in mind when we're looking at the image quality. I expect the image quality from the Canon R5 to be far superior to that of the X-H2. So it'd be really interesting to see. Also in terms of weight, the Fuji X-H2 and these two lenses come in around about 500 grams lighter than this setup. So I think that's about 1 pound, 1.5 ounces. So yeah, just significantly lighter really. I think half a kilogram is quite a bit. So let's take a look at the castle shot first with the side light. Now I should mention at this point that Lightroom doesn't display Fuji RAW files particularly well when zooming into an image. Images often look flat, noisy and lack detail, and this is why a lot of Fuji users opt to edit in Capture One. For me though, I've had better results with using Lightroom and a plugin called DxO Pure RAW 3. Now Pure RAW 3 not only provides Lightroom with a DNG file which it can display better, but it also has fabulous denoising capabilities too. It's a great tool. One of the big issues when comparing different camera systems for image quality is how the software renders the image, which is why we'll be printing some of these images today later on in the video. Now I did some tests with the Canon full frame files with Pure RAW, and with images shot at ISO 100, every single time I preferred the Canon original file. I think this is mainly because the image quality at ISO 100 coming out of the R5 is really clean, and Lightroom displays the detail wonderfully, so there's little point in running a conversion. Before we start, these are unedited raw files with Lightroom's default sharpening and lens corrections applied to the Canon file, and Pure Raw 3's lens corrections and standard sharpening applied to the Fuji files. So not the same processing, but they are not the same system, so they need to be treated differently to get the most from the file. This first shot was captured on the standard zoom lenses at 70mm on the Canon and 45 on the Fuji. So first up, this shot of the castle has soft light on the left hand side. Now this image is a tale of two halves really. I think the Fuji looks better in good light, whereas the Canon looks better in poor light. So let's take a look at the nicely lit side of the image first. As you can see, both images show amazing detail at 100%, but I feel the way the detail is rendered is nicer on the Fuji file. The tree on the left has a touch of purple fringing on the Canon file too, whereas the Fuji tree looks just fine. Around the front of the castle, the Canon file looks a little more contrasty, but I prefer how the detail is rendered in the Fuji file, especially in the iron railings in the window. Round to the darker shady side of the castle, I prefer the Canon as it displays more detail in the scaffolding and around the tops of the ramparts. Fujifilm starts to lack definition here. Now over to the far right of the image and probably the darkest corner, and we can see the Canon has a touch more detail in the stonework, grasses and rocks. But in both cases the comparisons are fairly similar and I feel totally acceptable throughout in my opinion. Next, let's take a look at the telephoto shot of the mill house at 177mm on the Canon and 110mm on the Fuji. The light on the mill was really nice, slightly to the side but mainly from the front and diffused really nicely by some high cloud. Both images look very similar at their normal ratio, but if we zoom into 100% we can see more detail in the Fuji file. Both are amazing though. Again, if we come over to the scaffolding, we can see more detail in the Fuji file. Where the Canon does excel though is at the far edge of the frame on the left. If we look at the top of the garden wall here, we can see the Fuji gets a bit soft, whereas the Canon holds on to this detail better. If we look at the opposite side of the photo though, we can see that in good light the Fuji holds that detail right to the edge of the frame. I think what we're seeing here is poor lighting on the left results in a softer area of the photo for the crop sensor camera. So as you can see from these images, it's pretty much tit for tat throughout these tests, but the real test will come when we take a look at the large prints side by side, which we're going to do in just a second, but there's a couple of things I just want to touch on before we get onto that. Firstly, dynamic range, as this does affect image quality. And as we can see from the Photons to Photos website test chart, the Canon boasts about an extra stop of dynamic range, and this is something that we often see as a big benefit that, full frame sensors have over crop sensor cameras. We can see this difference if we go back to the shot of the mill. The shadow is slightly darker on the roof on the Fuji file. So that one stop does sound like a lot, but actually when you look at the two side by side, it's fairly negligible I think, but there is a difference, so that may be something to consider. Before we get onto the prints, I just want to mention depth of field, as this also affects image quality. If we go back to the mill shot, we can see the depth of field is different, even though our framing and aperture are the same in both shots. The depth of field is different because the focal length is different. We are more zoomed in on the full frame system to get the same framing as the Fuji. The more we zoom in, the shallower our depth of field becomes if we don't change our camera position or aperture. So for this example, we can see that the Canon depth of field falls away just before the start of the wall, and the Fuji depth of field falls away just in front of the second darker patch of water. Both images were focused on the white door in the middle of the main building. So at f8, the crop sensor has significantly more depth of field. Now this is great for landscape photography where we want to get a large depth of field. To get a similar depth of field on the full frame camera without moving the camera position, we would need to shoot this scene at maybe f11 or f16. I feel you're more likely to do more focus stacking on a full frame system than you would on a crop sensor system. That's if you wish to shoot at this sweet spot of the lens when looking for a large depth of field. Now, I should point out, a lot of photographers may want a really shallow depth of field, and this is where the full frame system will win, as it offers a shallower depth of field at the same framing as a crop sensor system. So this might better suit, say, a portrait photographer. So this really depends on what you're shooting. So let's take a look at these prints, and then we'll look at some of the higher ISO images that I took and see how the full frame and crop sensors compare for that. So yes, these are the 3 prints that I made of the mill. So these prints here are printed on A3 paper, but they are only part of the image of the mill. If I was to print this image full size, it would make an A1 print. So that's 33 inches wide or 84 centimeters wide. As you can see from the image here, this is the crop of the photo that I've printed. So I gave these 3 prints here to 3 other people and asked them to place them in order of most detailed and least detailed. And all of the results came back exactly the same. And they were exactly the same as what I thought too. So this is as consistent as it's going to get. So first up, I wanted to compare the Fuji RAW file, which is this one here, with the Canon RAW file with no pure RAW 3 conversion on the Fuji file, so both straight out of camera on both systems. And if we stand 1 meter back from the prints, which is probably about where you'd stand for an A1 print I think, then the Canon just pips it marginally. If we get closer to say 1 foot away from the print, we start to see that the Canon file, the Canon print is more detailed. So I think that concludes that when printing from Lightroom on an unprocessed Fuji RAW file, it isn't perfect. It's still completely acceptable, but it's not perfect and it's not quite as good as the Canon file. The Canon looks great, by the way, even close up. You would not ever need any more detail in an A1 size print. It's simply stunning. So a big thumbs up to Canon. So next, let's bring up the Fuji print that has had the pure RAW 3 conversion. Now, if I stand 1 meter away from these 2 prints side by side, I cannot see any difference whatsoever, except that the shadow on the roof of the Fuji print is ever so slightly darker than that on the Canon print. Now these photos were taken exactly the same time. I pressed the shutter button at the same time on both cameras with a 2-second timer, so the light was the same on both of them, but that is because of the dynamic range which we discussed earlier, so it shows that in the print as well. Now when we get 1 foot away from the image, or 30 centimeters, now this is where it's quite surprising, the Fuji actually shows a smidgen more detail. So if you're going to get really close to the image and inspect it or get a magnifying glass out, there is more detail in the Fuji file. Just a touch. Now you can't really notice this. If I get back to about 1.5 feet, you can't see the difference. It's only when you're inspecting it really, really closely, or with a magnifying glass or with reading glasses on or something like that, that you can see the difference. Both of these prints are absolutely packed with detail. They're unbelievable. A1, they're both printing larger than their native print sizes. Absolutely stunning. This is a 33-inch print, which is about so wide. Absolutely brilliant. I don't think you would ever need any more detail in a print than you're getting from these 2 files. And yeah, it's very, very difficult to tell the 2 apart. So now I just want to quickly touch on higher ISO, because generally speaking, full frame cameras will produce better results at higher ISO values. This shot of my lovely garden wall was shot at ISO 1600 on both systems. Straight out of camera, the Canon wins hands down, but again that's partly to do with the software incompatibility rather than higher ISO. In this example, both have had pure RAW 3 conversions to reduce the noise and convert the file to a DNG, which allows Lightroom to view the Fuji file a little better. So let's take a look at the top left of the frame where you'd expect the image quality to be at its worst. And as you can see, there is little to choose between the 2 images. If you're going to maybe pick the bones out of it, maybe you could say the Canon just pips it, but it's so difficult to choose between the 2. I'd be completely happy printing both of these images at ISO 1600 on both of these cameras. So I think from my comparisons here is that we can determine that image quality is very similar from both full frame and crop sensor cameras. The Fuji perhaps getting the upper hand in the well lit situations, and the Canon probably getting the upper hand in the poorly lit areas. So many of you may think this isn't a fair comparison because I've used pure RAW 3 to process the Fuji file, but that's just something Fuji users have to deal with if they're going to use Lightroom as their chosen editing software. Just remember, we're dealing with a RAW file here. These files are meant to be edited. Now, how you get the desired result is very much down to the individual photographer. What I can tell you though is that it's totally possible to get comparable image quality from an APS-C camera and a full frame camera. I should also mention here that camera systems vary so much. A lot of the time it's the glass you put in front of the camera or the software that you use to process it that will make all of the difference. So make of this what you will. Now I must stress this video is not sponsored by DxO Pure Raw 3. It's just a plugin I use all of the time and I think it's fantastic. There is a link in the description to a 30-day free trial though. You don't have to pay anything, no credit card payments or anything like that. Just go and download it, try it out for yourself for 30 days, nothing to lose, well worth a look. If you're interested in everything I carry in my landscape photography camera bag, please be sure to check out this video that's over here. And if you like this video, please be sure to give it a like and share it too if you think others might like it. That helps me out more than anything, I think. Until next week, take care and I'll see you soon.